Hello, everyone. Welcome back to another episode of Picture Stage Tips brought to you by Alma Pictures LLC as part of the Second Seas Cube series. And this time we are going to explore a variety of different sorts of works for you in this video essay from a producer's point of view. Now, some of these works you may be familiar with. Some of these works may be new to you, but maybe you will find something to explore here. And essentially, what is the purpose of this? As before, the main purpose, of course, is to analyze some very interesting works, spanning from Greek tragedy to classical comedy to allegory to cinema, and each one is treated in light of adaptability for the stage. So this can include things such as longevity, story, authority, constraint, escalation, moral transmission, stage viability, and so forth. So especially we're more interested if these kind of works can go across production context and looking at, what works, what doesn't work, and so forth in this video essay. So the first one we're going to start with is Medea, and this is by Euripides. And this is not just a story that some people may think about, oh, it's just a story about vengeance or whatever. It's more about betrayal, exile, maternal contradictions, and moral ruptures under pressure. So, of course, the governing principle is severe and legible. And we understand when trust is destroyed at the root, that's a very important factor when we think about language becoming unstable and other things becoming unstable. So, if you want to adapt the work, it can only really survive if Medea is really intellectually lucid and if the household conflict is really clear and if emotional escalation is governed by real precise moments of action rather than having it be a melodrama or something like that. The audience has to feel the order of injury and response, and if not, it's going to weaken the audience's reception. So the audience watches the mind and household collapse in public. So this really depends on interrogation, appeal, delay, strategic silence, and choices. So the core tension here is if power, once dishonored, can still obey moral proportion. So who is betrayed, who controls the narrative, who's forced to speak, and who understands the cost before others understand it. That's what makes this story interesting. And the authority system here is domestic authority is broken and reconstructed through speech. Jason's social legitimacy is exposed. And Medea's authority is very tactical psychologically and eventually absolute. So the world is closed. Exile, gender status, and social isolation are limited factors. And this is part of the pressure engine here. So nothing happens in so-called moral freedom because every action has constraints around it. So the play is moving as delay and tightening. The audience has to feel this petition, this refusal, the interventions, temporary claims, and turn of events that really make this play powerful. And if you want to adapt it to anything besides the original drama, which is an amazing piece of work, you have to consider how you're going to do that to keep the audience really engaged. Yeah, the language is very direct, concentrated, and dangerous. And there are a lot of confrontations here that show action through words. So the first act, we can look at wound and dispossession. The betrayal is established here, and the house is already morally broken, so the audience needs to feel that the true event happens before the play begins. And then there's this strategic claim, if you look at Act 2, where Medea appears controlled, and that calm is kind of operational, because there's a lot of negotiation, persuasion, and apparent submission happening here. And then we have the horror and irreversible justice part, which is this logic keeps going, and the climax is the collision of intelligence, revenge, and sacrilege. So the lighting, of course, needs to emphasize exposure and enclosure, and bright light can feel judicial, and shadow can feel sometimes conspiratorial. So, but the whole thing should kind of look like a mousetrap or a moral trap. So the tension emerges from thresholds, doors, witnessing, stillness before action, and so forth. So the audience needs to be able to track who is inside, who is outside, who has crossed the line already. And the eyes need to follow this pressure, the blocked exits, objects of consequence, and shifts between plea to command. So the whole thing is going to fall apart if Medea is just looked at as a raging, raving person, or if Jason becomes a cartoon villain, or if the children are treated as plot devices. In the chorus, maybe you treat it as really irrelevant or therapeutic ending. That will not work. It has to be as hard as it is in the play, although you can kind of adapt it different ways. This is really good for a small cast as the original version, and also if you adapt it. And there needs to be close audience proximity if possible. And it's good for psychological pressure if you can do that. And you can use a chorus for the conscience and the house becoming, of course, the moral tribunal. And there are a few props here that you need, and you just have to have strong vocal discipline and good movement. So the text needs to carry the burden. So this is not just a very trivial piece. It's very heavy. So the audience needs to understand the logic before the catastrophe hits. So the risk to put it on is about low medium. Ensemble size would be 6 to 14 players. Touring visibility is 9 out of 10. And please don't stage if you don't get permission to work with children, or if the conflict becomes too vague, or the text is treated as modern issue pamphlet, or if the final act is diluted. So basically, obviously, there will be children involved in this show, and so you have to treat them well and take care of them if you're going to have child actors. And it's also a very hard place, so people need to realize that. Now, the staging premise, we would say 12, audience, okay, so basically we're rating it pretty high. We're going to give it a 95 out of 100. So basically, it's a definitely priority production, has high repertory value as well. So definitely one that we recommend taking around if you can handle the gravity of the piece. The next piece is the Bacchae. And this is by, of course, Euripides. And this is another tragedy. And this is not about someone going crazy. Like, just like Medea's story is not just about craziness. Like, oh, this person went crazy and then this happened. No, it's more powerful than that, actually. So if you look at the power factor here, oh, sorry. If you look at that, you can see that it's about authority, ecstasy, ritual possession, and limits of rational control. This principle is very simple. A society that attempts to exclude part of human nature eventually confronts it in a more destructive form. So it only can survive if Dionysius is attractive and frightening at the same time, if Pentheus is understandable rather than just a fool, and if the conflict between order and ecstasy is balanced. And if one side becomes obviously correct, then you can't really feel the tragedy here. So the audience watches competing forms of authority struggling for legitimacy here. And so the dramaturgy, of course, depends on seduction, disguise, revelation, ritual, and transformation. Now, the core is not belief versus unbelief. It's whether the human order can survive after denying forces larger than itself. So what is reality here? What mistakes control mystery? Who is commanding? Who is following? These are all questions that you should ask yourself before you stage it. And Pentheus is showing us civic order here, law, hierarchy, and surveillance, and Dionysius is showing ritual authority, transformation, mastery, and collective energy, and neither can fully eliminate the other. So the city attempts to contain the divine, and all these attempts increase instability. So the tighter the civic structure becomes, the more violently it breaks. So the play is, of course, advancing through progressive destabilization. So there's warning, mockery, temptation, submission, catastrophe, and so forth. And the audience should feel this feeling of dread and this feeling of tension as you go along. So knowledge goes through testimony and revelation here, and messengers are very important because the work teaches through witness consequences rather than direct argument. So in the beginning, the divine force enters the city. Pentheus rejects legitimacy. Conflict appears political, but is not. It's metaphysical. The audience should recognize danger before the ruler does. Dionysius gains the advantage. Pentheus moves from resistance to fascination. Control is shifting. And then the last part, there's a lot of collapse of social order, and the recognition comes too late. So climax is not just physical. The climax as the revelation that destruction was invited by earlier blindness. So we have lighting needs to function ritually. It will need to show the different perceptions between the metaphysical and the physical. And darkness can show hidden force or incomplete understanding and ambiguity here. It shouldn't be a spectacle. The visual tension comes from ritual formation, group movement, masking, symmetry breaking, and so forth. So the audience needs to constantly come into this point where they can evaluate authority structure, which structure is kind of dominating. So your eye should move towards the ritual centers, collective movement, authority figures under pressure, and so forth. If Dionysius is just a villain, that's not going to work. Or if Pentheus becomes ridiculous only, that's not going to work. They have to have their full characterization in order to make this work. And again, you cannot connect this play to contemporary politics alone. And so it's only surviving through ambiguity, danger, and ritual seriousness here as it plays out in such a fascinating way. So you could do a chorus-centered production emphasizing music, rhythm, collective movement, and ceremonial progression, very similar to the other one, which could be done in musical form, orchestral form, dance form as well. And you can use natural landscapes, ruins, forests, or non-traditional spaces. And you could also do a very reduced version with masks, voice percussion, shadow, and so forth. But the divine should come through rather than technology. So this is like a little bit of a warning that order detached from human reality becomes self-destructive. So the audience needs to feel the attraction of Dionysius before fearing him. And as far as putting it all together, you could do it with an ensemble of 12 to 40 players. Towing is about 7 out of 10. Wristband is about medium. And you really need to make sure it's convincing and not just like a farce. It has to have this gravity, this complexity that makes people think in order for it to work. And we're going to give it a 94 out of 100 because it could be a very priority production, especially for people and institutions, which can make a really interesting scenescape and has a big enough cast. The next one here is Dante Alighieri, Divine Comedy. And this is a very interesting allegory that is, of course, first made in poem, but you can put it into the stage. And this is not just a story about, oh, the afterlife and hell and heaven and purgatory. It's something a bit deeper than that. It's more about moral ascent, spiritual education, judgment, and setting the heart towards the truth that the author is trying to point people to. So the work can only survive if the journey is intelligible, the moral architecture is very clear, and movement through the realms produces genuine thought. So even if someone doesn't believe the author's premise, it has to come out of this world of decorative fantasy, and it has to come into this world of thinking clearly about the kinds of moral issues that the author is pointing out here. So if the cosmology and the travel don't depend on encounter, recognition, confession, instruction, and ascent, it's going to really water it down. And it shouldn't be treated like a farce. The core attention here is not about did Dante reach the end of the journey. It's more like whether he is capable of seeing reality here. So who is trapped, who understands, and what does this teach the modern audience, even if their worldview is different? I think that's something that audiences need to consider. and producers. Now there's the structure operations where there's an authority system, hierarchical moral authority, guidance is transmitted through legitimate teachers. Virgil governs reason, Beatrice is governing spiritual vision. Authority comes through wisdom rather than just force alone. So then we have every realm operating according to moral consequence. The architecture itself is kind of a background structure that's really important. So no soul occupies its position arbitrarily, and the world does possess intelligible order. So the truth moves from descent, observation, intuition, purification, and illumination, and each part expands perception. The audience needs to feel increasing clarity. And if the work transmits enough meaning through encounter, every character becomes an example or a teacher. So, first of all, you have the Inferno, of course, where disorder is visible. The audience encounters disordered forms of desire and power. And the central question is recognition. So, can you understand the nature of each of the errors and what the real lesson is trying to teach? The next part is purgatorio, of course, transformation becoming possible, effort, discipline, repentance, and hope come into the system. And this is the center of the work. The audience must feel movement rather than punishment, because that's the point of purgatory. And then we have paradiso, of course. Vision is replacing the struggle. The climax is not about, oh, I forced my way through. It's more like connecting to something higher and bigger than oneself. And it depends on wonder, proportion, and contemplation. So lighting, of course, needs to be really carefully done here. The Inferno could use limitation, Purgatorio could use progression, and Paradiso could use expression or expansion, for example. The light should show clarification, not just spectacle, and tension can come through threshold, elevation, distance, procession, and order changes. The audience needs to understand where they are within the moral scene. And the eyes should move towards guides, pathways, transitions, hierarchical relationships, and moments of recognition. The most important is how ascent becomes physically visible. So this can collapse if the cosmology becomes fantasy tourism or vague moral structure, or oh, it's just a spectacle, or oh, this is a visually cluttered paradiso, or the audience cannot really feel the purpose of what the author is writing there. You could do it as an immersive environmental production. You could do it as where the people go through the different phases. It could be also done as processional theater with stations, choral movement, music, and ceremonial progression. It could be done as minimalist allegorical adaptation using light, voice, chorus, and symbolic staging. Or it could be done as dance, or you could do it as a theater play as well. It's not just a spectacle about heaven versus hell or, oh, you horrible person. It's more staged as a pilgrimage, and it should be where the audience can just reflect on some of these points where the author is highlighting. So, of course, it's a very high risk, of course, because it involves religious themes, but it also involves about 20 to 100 performers, so it's not very nice for touring. And I think it's very big concern if the audience cannot really feel this progression or the intention behind the author's point of view. So as far as this, we will give it a 92 because if it's done well, it could be done for a major production house, festival institution, pilgrimage theater, immersive work, repertory companies capable of sustaining a larger moral scale piece. But only in those cases, because otherwise it would be too expensive. The next work here is called Enter the Dragon. And so previous one was done in Dante Alighieri. I forget if I said that. This one is by Bruce Lee and Golden Harvest. And this is a martial arts film, of course. This is not just a fighting story or action story or, oh, that's nice martial arts and cool sound effects and whatever. It's actually about discipline, self-mastery, and moral testing. So The authority is shown through controlled action under pressure, and it can survive, of course, if combat is very meaningful, physical excellence is very visible on the stage, and the protagonist's discipline is more important than just the victory. So the film itself worked very well, but it is a little bit complicated to put on the stage. Now, it can work on the stage because the audience can understand the conflict physically before it's verbally explained, and it depends on challenge, observation, initiation, escalation, and demonstration. And so the point is whether discipline mastery can prevail against corruption and domination. So who is in control? Who has the force? Who acts with purpose? Who acts with from appetite? So basically, there are some structures and operations. For example, authority systems, meritocratic authority, status earned through competence. Strongest figures are capable of restraint. Legitimacy comes from discipline. Constraint systems, every encounter has physical limits. There's, of course, time, space, and fatigue that show the outcome. The body is also a field of consequence here. So the rhythm comes between observation, preparation, testing, confrontation, and revelation. And each encounter increases the pressure. So the audience should feel this progression. And there's meaning transmitted through action, of course, and the function of the combat is part of the character's argument as well. So movement reveals character more clearly than dialogue. So in this case, it could be used dance would work or stage drama. You could also bring this into some kind of combination with music. There's a lot of different things that could be done with it, but let's break down a little bit of the structure here. So, of course, the protagonist comes into an unfamiliar environment. The contest appears pretty straightforward, but then there's hidden structures of power that come out, and the audience should sense that the tournament conceals deeper conflict. So then next we have investigation. This is the visible competition and hidden corruption are coming together. The protagonist gathers information while remaining under pressure. And then we have physical conflict and moral conflict going together, and you see the public exposure of false authority. So you could see that the light should show visibility and vulnerability, and the audience needs to read the bodies very clearly. Tension comes from distance, readiness, stillness before movement, spatial imbalance, and controlled escalation as well. We have to see who has the initiative, who is on the upper hand right now, and to look at power, posture, reaction, movements, and positional control. Now, we don't just need a semiotic imitation here. That's not good. It needs to enhance the story in some way that helps the audience feel the character a little bit more on the stage. Now, this could, of course, be a martial theater adaptation, as we said, live comment, choreography, physical storytelling, tournament arena production, audience surrounds the action. Or you could do a minimalist combat drama, for example, extreme reduction using open space, training implements, rhythm, and so forth. Now, this is where the audience needs to really understand the moral distance between discipline and domination through movement. This goes, like I said, it could be done in a form of dance choreography as well, but we have to emphasize the movement. The movement is really important to the other story as well. This could be done at a medium risk with 12 to 30 performers, as long as everybody is trained well. And could be toured with 12 to 30, performers. It could be toured. Everyone really needs a lot of good physical training and stunt work. And it really needs to be done safely, incredibly, unlike Bruce Lee, who takes a lot of risks on his productions. Unless he is directing it, then that's up to you. But the point is not for a spectacle. This is a character's really personal journey that needs to come through in terms of an adaptation here. So we could say it would be an 85%. And it could be programmed well if supported by elite fight direction, good movement training, and a commitment to developing and enhancing the narrative that's already very strong. in this work. As every work that we talk about here, make sure you talk to the creators and get the rights, and of course, collaborate with them if you can. And obviously, some things would be more harder to stage, so we're not recommending that you stage things or not stage things. We're just saying it may be possible if it works for your case. Now we have the next one is Lysistrata by Aristophanes. Some people say, oh, that's just a comedy about sex. Well, not really. It's a lot deeper than that. You can look at civil paralysis, political absurdity, collective action, and the exposure of public foolishness through private leverage. So the principle is very simple here. When institutions fall, ordinary citizens may discover forms of power that rulers overlook. So you have to look at a very coherent ensemble, and you really need to have good comedy here. So obviously the original work is a play, and of course there are really vulgar moments. So this is definitely not for kids. But it should show more than just the sensual element here. And so if the sensual material overwhelms the civic argument, then it's just fluff. So you need to look at coalitions, negotiation, public embarrassment, escalating frustrations, reconciliation, and so forth. Of course, this was originally staged as a drama, which is obviously great. But if you want to adapt it to dance or some other ways, like music or immersive theater or other things, you have to be very careful. So the question really is who's controlling the resources, who can sustain discipline, who breaks first, who takes power for authority. And we have different systems, like our authority is redistributed, traditional leadership proves ineffective, collective civic action generates new leverage, power emerges from organization rather than rank. And there's both sides depending upon self-restraint, and the strike creates a shared burden. The pressure increases because every participant is constrained by the system they are attempting to change. So you can see rhythm coming between organization, resistance, temptation, escalation, and settlement. And the audience needs to feel increasing absurdity alongside increasing effectiveness. So meaning can survive through comic inversion. And this play works really well because it exposes contradictions. And let's see. So the organization is unlikely coalition forms. The proposal appears impossible. The audience immediately understands both objectives and obstacles. Then we have the pressure part where the strategy starts to work, resistance grows, participants struggle to maintain discipline. And then we have the leadership reality of the local government and so forth yields to sustained pressure. And this is about restoration of civic order, but in a different way than one might expect. So lighting should support the pace and the clarity of the work, and you could see it needs to have good visibility, and you need to avoid a lot of atmospheric treatment. So the audience always needs to understand where the authority comes from visually. You can look at group formation, public confrontations, physical restraint, comic reversals, and escalating imbalances for the visual. And the eyes should connect towards the leaders, allegations, obstacles, comic obstacles, and moments of action. Now, the whole point of this show is not just the sexual humor, although it is something that drives the show for people when they want to see it. It needs to work well as a satire. So you don't want this to become, oh, this is a political thing. It is making a point about some things, but it shouldn't be, oh, this is a partisan show or whatever. It needs to be the comedy that it is and let it tell its own story for people to come to their own conclusions. So really needs good ensemble acting, public physical comedy, clear structures, and also, you should preserve the collective action kind of mechanism, which is part of the joke here, and also part of the satire here. But you can adapt it to different contexts, depending on your location. Now, this has large cast, music, movement, and public celebration. And so it should not be a farce. It needs to make people laugh, but it also needs to make people think about, businesses or other kinds of institutions that often fall into similar kinds of traps if they're not careful. So here we have a low risk overall, unless you make it political. And then 12 to 35 people could be there. Obviously you have to pay attention to the rules of different places where you'd like to go. Sometimes this may not work for some countries. Obviously you need to have good connections and clarity about whether this show is able to be staged where you are. Now, if the ensemble cannot sustain a good rhythm and adaptation is just reducing the work to something political or sexual, it's not going to be credible. It has to have the original intention, which is to make the audience think through this very different sort of work. Now, the final score here, we would give it a 90%. It could be a good production for certain types of repertory companies, festivals, universities, or civic theaters, which can balance satire, ensemble discipline, and public intelligibility. But this conflict could be also translated across cultures and institutions. For example, it could be about a business, or it could be about a factory or something like that as well. It doesn't have to be about governments specifically. But it is important to be done with discretion if you're going to put it on. Okay, the next one is Oresteia. And this is by Aeschylus. And this here is not really just a surface level story. Some people think about, oh, this is a revenge, or this is an angry person here, an angry person there. Oh, two-dimensional. No, this is about justice, inheritance, political order, and transformation of violence into a more firm structure here, or norm. A civilization survives when private vengeance yields to public judgment in this case. So you need to show, if you really want to adapt this, because of course it's a play, so it can be done as a play, it could be done as a dance, you could do it as an opera, actually. There are a few other ways it could be done, but it can only work if every act shows the moral consequences, and if justice is just bureaucratic, it doesn't work that well. Because the audience needs to see the whole moral order being replaced. And the whole thing depends on murder, obligation, pursuit, judgment, and the transformation of an institution. It's not who is committing some crime or something. You really need to think about where the system can end in the chain of retaliation. Because it's a lot of murders and stuff happening. So who is in control? Who can change the cycle of death, for example? Now, this is a trilogy, so it has 3 successive systems: household authority, clan authority, civic authority, and each provides stronger and more stable than the one preceding it. Then the movement happens between them is very important. So every action has an obligation. The characters inherit debts they did not make, and freedom is limited by lineage, oaths, memories, and so forth. Nobody's going to this conflict voluntarily. So the structure also expands progressively, and the rhythm goes through crime, consequence, pursuit, trial, and settlement. And each play increases the scope from family to civilization. And we also have meaning surviving through ritual repetition, and the audience learns through these patterns of accusation, sacrifice, and judgment. So we have Agamemnon first, which is the victory. Victory returns home carrying corruption. The household is already poisoned. and the audience watches the first public collapse. The murder, of course, appears to be decisive, but it's only the beginning. Then we have libation bearers in the second part, where inheritance becomes obligation and the next generation is drawn into cycle. Revenge shows nothing about restoration. And this is the center of the work. And then we have amenities. Amenities, that's hard to say. And basically you go to the civic level there. So the climax here is adjudication. Violence goes to large lawful process. There's a new reality of governance there. So lighting needs to show darkness belonging to secrecy, blood guilt, inherited guilt, and light coming to public visibility and judgment and so forth. And the final movement should increase clarity there. So we have tensions coming from thresholds, altars, assemblies, processions, rituals, and so forth. Now, your eyes should move towards centers of judgment, ritual actions, public witness, and power changes. So again, you shouldn't reduce this to family melodrama. And of course, the political transformation or government transformation, however you want to call it, should not just be a minimized corner of the world. Because if you do that, then you kind of just minimize it. So the whole thing really needs to work with the chorus, with a very good cast, and the audience needs to be able to think about different elements here. So don't reduce it too much either, and consider that the final trial is more consequential than the other stuff. So that should really be emphasized. A few other notes. Risk would be swords medium. Ensemble size could be 15 to 50 players. A little bit hard to tour. And don't stage if the trilogy is fragmented or if it's more of a cynical approach, or if the audience cannot follow this transfers of authority, or if it just becomes one-dimensional. So that would be. And also you have, of course, again, like a lot of Greek plays, you need to make sure that you have permission from your local governments and places to do this, because it's not for everyone. And this would be a very high priority repertory production for production houses that can stage it, because it's an interesting work for institutions interested in studying tragedy, civic theater, governance, and relationships between violence and legitimacy. So we could give it around a 95%. Among the surviving dramatical works, Oresteia is one of the strongest theatrical architectures ever written, which is another reason why it should be played or studied at least. That the reason is because the central achievement is not the murderers, the curses, or the characters. It's showing the birth of a legitimate public order. So that's very interesting, because it goes from the household level all the way towards a national level scene. The next one is The Persians by Aeschylus as well. This is also a tragedy. This is a system about imperial overreach, political blindness, collective grief, and the cost of power detached from measure. And this talks about a state that mistakes magnitude for wisdom, eventually discovers its own limits through catastrophe. This can survive if the defeated perspective remains central, the mourning remains dignified, and the political consequences emerge through lament. Now, victory does not need to be the subject instead of loss, because it's really about loss. The audience experiences a major historical event from the point of view of those who lost, so that's why it's important. And the dramaturgy depends on anticipation, reportage, recognition, limitation, and judgment. And the tension is how civilization confronts reality once illusion collapses. Who's responsible? Who saw the danger? Who ignored limits? Who must live with the consequence? So we have imperial authority examined through absence. The king is gone. Power is discussed, remembered, and judged rather than exercised. Authority becomes the subject of inquiry. We have the court possessing almost no ability to change events. News travels faster than actions, including gossip. The characters are trapped within consequences already created. The dramatic confinement generates pressure, and the rhythm moves through waiting, news, recognition, mourning, and revelation. The audience should feel this inevitability coming through, but also like gradual understanding. So meaning is coming through testimony. of the messengers and so forth. Catastrophe becomes visible through carefully structured reporting. So, first part is anxiety dominates the court, audience senses instability before the confirmation arrives, the empire waits for news. That is redefining it. Then we have the revelation of the messenger. Defeat is definitely undeniable. This is the center of the play, and this affects every relationship. And then we have lamentation. The empire confronts itself. Grief is there. The climax is understanding what the battle means to them. So the lighting needs to show dignity, avoid battlefield realism, and also you should consider tragedy occurring in memory, testimony, and consequence. So we see this as in a way to reveal things. You can see tension coming from stillness, former processions, collective mourning, empty space, and the weight of absence. And the eye should move towards messengers, ritual centers, symbols of authority, and figures receiving the information. It doesn't need to be nationalist, triumphalism, or caricature. It needs to really focus on the heavy points of what happens when cultures change. And it needs to have dignity, restraint, and intelligence. So again, this is needing to emphasize the court ritual and public mourning and extreme focus on testimony and consequence. So again, you can use choral voice, procession, music, and symbolic architecture. This is defeat, as I said. You have to feel the collapse of illusion and grief. So the risk band is about medium, depending on the country. 10 to 25 performers, you could tour it, and it's very concerning if the work is just some kind of spectacle, or if dignity of the defeated is removed, or if the messenger report is just informational, or the production confuses scale with noise. We're going to give that a 90%. This is good for classical companies, civic theaters, festivals, and institutions who are interested in leadership, empire, and accountability, and the effects of war. It's not for every country, of course. What makes the Persians extraordinary is not the subject, but the point of view. Most war dramas stage victory, heroism, and combat. This is about consequences, so that means the audience needs to watch the empire receive its own limitation. That's something interesting, because it shows Cicero's principle of measured authority. Power without prudence destroys itself. So that's what makes it interesting. The next one is The Island of Greed by Michael Mark. And this is a thriller. Now, this is a performance system about institutional capture, patronage, dependency, and erosion of public legitimacy. When private interests dominate public institutions, authority becomes transactional. So you can let this work survive if the institutional relationships are clear, corruption networks are understandable, and the audience can follow the flow of influence without exposition. There's too much exposition. So you don't need this to be a collection of scandals. That's not what this is about. So that's where you really need to have discretion. You want to stage it as a play or as a dance piece or as another kind of performing arts piece. The audience looks at how this public authority is being hollowed out. So it depends on negotiation, favor, exchange, coercion, investigation, and exposure. The core is not whether corruption exists, obviously. We need to look at who controls the resources, who controls information, who owes whom, and who still possesses independent authority. So we have competing authority structures, formal authority, and practical authority. So public institutions versus networks of influence. The drama shows the widening gap between the two. And every participant gets entangled in this. So we have obligations, financial dependency, personal loyalty, and fear. Everyone's dependent on everybody. And so we have transactions, escalation, cover-up, investigation, and revelation. Not everyone on every single person, but everyone is dependent on somebody. We need to feel the institutional instability here as well, and meaning survives through visible exchange. Power comes through meetings, favors, intermediaries, and public appearances. Corruption must be dramatized through action. So firstly, the audience encounters the power structure. Relationships are mostly functional, hidden costs are partially concealed. Then we have influence expanding, institutions compromise, and the audience needs to see that individual wrongdoing has become structural here. And the hidden system becomes visible. A climax is not one arrest or scandal. It's public recognition of the institutional decays there. So you should have the difference in lighting between public appearances, private transactions, of course. Visibility and concealment are very important. Avoid too much realism. The audience needs to understand the power tensions immediately. You can see that through, of course, meetings, corridors, closed rooms, press events, and so forth. The audience must continually look and see who is evaluating whom. So you can look at the decision makers, the intermediaries, symbolic centers of authority, and so forth. Now, the important thing is to see how influence becomes visible without exposition. Now, this will not work if the structure is too confusing, or if characters become interchangeable, or if corruption is a spectacle, or if we have too much exposition, or the institutional relationships are not very clear. This is good for a chamber drama, focusing on hearings, negotiations, and public accountability, or you could use it as in the institutional theater context, where we see competing centers of authority through spatial organization. Maybe could work as dance, definitely possibly could work as opera as well. You need to use tables, documents, phones, and other strategic movement as well to make it work. This is something where the audience needs to understand that corruption is very dangerous and becomes normal. And this is a medium risk, 12 to 30 performers. It could be toured. And do not stage if the audience cannot track influence, if adaptation reduces everything to conspiracy, or public institutions disappear from the narrative. And also, you have to be very careful where this is staged, because this will not work in all the places of the world. So this is 82 out of 100. You need to program cautiously, but you can program when the production team can maintain exceptional clarity on institutional relationships. So most corruption drama is focusing on the wrongdoer, but it works better when you have something like a study of systemic dependency, which is what this does very well. The next work is One Cell in the Sea by Fine Frenzy, or Alison Sudol. And we're not going to share the music today. I forgot to do that. But the point is that this is a wonderful vocal emotional architecture built around fragility of perception, interior monologue under romantic pressure, and nature as a psychological mirror, as well as memory as a melodic recursion. So we can definitely share all this album linked in the comment section. But the thing here, which makes the album so interesting, is that emotional states are sung into structural existence, and it's good for adapting to the stage if the voice is central. Lyric ambiguity is preserved, and musical repetition is treated as dramatic escalations. So this can work if the audience can follow the arrival of vulnerability, compression of longing, rapture of romantic expectation, withdrawal into interior silence. And this depends on tonal shifts rather than narrative turn. Lyrical repetition can show psychological pressure. And the voice is a character and environment here. So you could include, this should be done more like musical theater, or you could do it like operatic theater if you adapted the vocals. But definitely there should be some musical element here, I think. So the core here is how much feeling can remain coherent. Now, the singer is the speaker, the witness, the subject, the emotional environment, and authority comes from tonal control. So constraint is internal, emotional constraint, relational ambiguity, unresolved longing, and so forth. And this makes a closed psychological acoustic space. So this is not linear. It refrains function as emotional return points versus act as memory fragments, and the progression is atmospheric, which makes it really interesting. So meaning can be transmitted, of course, through vocal timbre, harmonic layering, lyrical composition, compression. You could even do this as a dance, actually, where you have her music playing or being performed and the dancers going through these states. So first part is the emotional awakening. The voice established fragility as the baseline condition. Nature and interiority are there. Then we have tension and distortion. So there's more emotional instability. Romantic imagery becomes unstable. The voice begins to fracture between intimacy and withdrawal. Then we have withdrawal and resolution without closure. So there's emotional quieting, unresolved tonal suspension, and return to soft repetition. So if you want to do this on stage, for example, you put dancers there, you should think about soft diffusion, dust state, illumination, avoidance of hard theatrical contrast, emotional shading rather than spatial definition. Intention comes from proximity of performers to audience, stillness between musical phrases, absence of dramatic event objects, and emotional visibility without narrative anchors. So you can look at the vocal production, the gazes, stillness between the refrains, and this can be done very well. And of course, if you want to do it not just as a musical performance, you want to put it in a dance or theatrical situation, it has to happen very carefully. Songs are not just scenes with dialogue meaning. So this can involve a small ensemble if you do it for dance, or 1 to 3 performers for chamber lyric, live vocal and minimal instrumentation, or it could be an installation performance where there's spatialized sound environment, fragmented voice presence, audience immersion, or it could be a concert theater hybrid, or where you have such structured set list as emotional arc, light driven narrative, minimum dialogue, or you could do it as a dance. The audience needs to feel and experience what this artist is trying to tell us and trying to unfold here. So the biggest concern is if the voice is not the primary expression, or if staging is too gaudy or spectacle-like. It needs to be very intimate and close to be able to work for the audience. So our score here would be 83%. It could be done on a more smaller scale. The next one is Winnie the Pooh. Now, that's A.A. Milne. And this is a moral ecosystem. And so, character is fixed and meaning emerges from the friction of stable personalities under changing small conditions. The work can survive if each character retains consistent cognitive logic. So Pooh is appetite, Eeyore is entropy, Piglet is fear under loyalty, Owl is performative intelligence. Anyway, the world remains spatially legible and contained. Events remain small but consequential within emotional terms. It can be done in dance, theater, and other ways. Now, the audience is observing repeatable moral mechanics in a bounded world. So there's misunderstandings between which become structure. Cooperation comes without ideology, specifically being said, failure is not catastrophic but meaningful, and friendship operates as a civic order. This depends on predictable character logic under minor disruption, comedic misalignment, intention, and outcome, and spatial navigation of shared environment. So we look at how stable identity behaves under trivial but meaningful disturbances. Authority is distributed and no character governs permanently. So we have perceived knowledge by the owl, physical capability by Pooh, and his accidental actions, and emotional reliability by Piglet. So we have situational authority here. Now, constraint is mild but constant. So we have limited geography, the 100-acre woods, of course, limited cognitive capacity, and limited problem-solving sophistication. So we have episodic time, which resets moral equilibrium, learning is partial, and repetition creates recognition. So meaning is transmitted through dialogue simplicity, behavioral repetition, spatial movement, and so forth. So, of course, the forest is introduced as a closed civic system. Characters appear as fixed behavioral principles, lost objects, misunderstandings, and weather changes. Misread intentions. Each event tests the identity without breaking it, and order returns, but not one fundamentally changes. Nobody fundamentally changes. So we have lighting that can be warm, continuous daylight logic. It can have seasonal variation, but it's not very harsh. It's just always inhabitable. The tension comes from scale contrast, navigation and misnavigation, object focus, honeypots, maps, lost items, and so forth, group clustering versus separation, and audience focus track, group formation, pauses before misunderstanding, physical comedy. These are all good. Now, it really shouldn't be forced into high stakes drama humor or replaced with sentimentality or characters are psychologically modernized. Or the forest is just a symbolic abstraction or something like that. You can do it with 6 to 10 performers. It's good for ritual family theater, intergenerational casting, repetition-based storytelling, audience participation, spatialized installation theater, forest is a navigatable set, audience moves through their episodes, and so forth. Or it could be done as a dance for children. This is one of the most very durable ensemble systems because the identity is stable, conflict is small but meaningful, and resolution restores. So it's very low risk and very, very adaptable across the world. So we will give it a 96%. Good for repertory theater. The next work is the Bhagavad Gita as it is. And this is by A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Prabhupada. This is a book, obviously. So it's a ritualized transmission system of metaphysical instruction structured around dialogue that is theological, ethical, existential, and performative. The principle is explicit. Knowledge is not presented for interpretation, but disciplined repetition, internalization, and enactment. It can only survive if the Krishna-Arjuna dialogue is very intact, speech is instructional, and repetition is preserved. So that's important. Now, the audience is seeing this controlled ethical cosmic argument as a spoken encounter. Doubt under existential pressure is there, instruction under crisis happens, moral paralysis comes through doctrinal clarity, and identity is reframed through metaphysical hierarchy. This depends on dialogue symmetry, teacher-disciple structure, escalation from confusion to instruction, transformation through spoken authority, and the question is, can a human subject remain coherent when confronted with absolute morals and metaphysical order? So our authority system here, we have authorities absolute and vertically structured. We have Krishna, metaphysical and moral totality, Arjuna, cognitive and ethical crisis subject. Authority is not negotiated here. So this produces a non-democratic dramaturgy of truth, where clarity is replacing ambiguity here. So constraint is existential. We have morality, duty, ignorance, attachment. There's no outside to the problem here. So time is having 3 layers. We have the battlefield crisis, the cyclical cosmology, reincarnation, dharma, and so forth, and eternal metaphysical order, timeless instruction layer. So meaning is also transmitted through dialogue, phrases, semantic reinforcement, and ritual cadence. We have, of course, Arjuna's paralysis, which is established on the battlefield. We have moral confusion. Then we have Krishna systematically dismantling the confusion, where identity is redefined, duty is clarified, attachment is reframed, and action without attachment comes to play. Then we have resolution through alignment, when cognitive disorder is replaced by structural understanding, action is reauthorized, and individual will is aligned with cosmic destiny. So we have high contrast lighting with battlefield exposure without aesthetic chaos. Emphasis is on visibility of instruction exchange. Tension comes through stillness between speech, proximity of teacher and disciple, battlefield chaos at a distance, mobility of doubt versus instruction. And then we have the focus towards the people, moments of hesitation, gestures of instruction, spatial separation, and so forth. Now, you have to know this is not for everyone, it's not for every stage, and this is a bit hard to adapt. So you need permission for that. And this should be a pretty minimalized cast. We could do it with two to six performers, text-driven performance with strict pacing and emphasis on vocal precision. We could also see this as an installation art, where audience goes into a cyclical recitation environment or sound of verses. So it's in more like a loop, a devotional loop. Now, this is more of, like we said, this transmission of moral metaphysical knowledge. So this is a pretty high risk. And you need 2 to 12 performers for it. So obviously you need to consider the point of view of the author and his perspective. And it cannot just be something like a satire or, oh, this is a fantasy or a fiction, because clearly this is the author's worldview. So the audience needs to interpret rather than receive structured transmission as well. So we have this as a 85%. This could be very well done in a sense of ritual theater or philosophic system. The next one is A Shropshire Lad by A. Houseman. There's a poetry cycle. And this is a cycle of statements organized around experience of youth under pressure, pastoral space as psychological container, fate as quieted force, death as structural inevitability. And the principle is emotion is not expressed through narrative development, but repeated formal containment of loss. It happens if the cyclical repetition of themes is preserved and tone remains restrained. So this works when we have youth speaking before understanding, consequence, memory, reframed as an inevitability. We have death coming into the story. It really needs repetition with variation, tonal restraint, and absence of narrative resolution. So the question is, how much feeling can be contained without becoming excessive? So authority is impersonal and atmospheric. We have fate, time, landscape, and cultural memory. Constraint is morality is assumed, not debated. Social mobility is not relevant. Emotional expression is limited by itself. Time is cyclical and elegiac. So poems are repeating emotional structures, and memory is more atmospheric. So that's important. Meaning comes through tight lyrical form, repetition of motifs, and restrained diction. So we have first part is about pastoral life appearing stable, but already shadowed by mortality awareness, sorry. And then we have death, separation, and missed lives recur in varied forms. And then we have no resolution, only tonal setting. So that's very interesting. You should use natural light, logic, dawn, dusk transitions, and avoid theatrical spotlight hierarchy. Tension comes from still figures in landscape, distance between speaker and horizons, absence of action, and contrast between stillness and implied loss. You should focus on the small moments between the characters, or if you have one performer by themselves. This should be done in the form of poetry, dramatized, so you could do it through dance. Be very interesting. You could do it as music, or you could even put it into a stage, but it would be more difficult as a stage work. Now, you could do it as lyrical chamber theater for 1 to 6 performers with strict poetic recitation disciplines and small movement. Or you could do it as orchestral voice cycle with multiple voices assigned recurring motifs. Musical underscoring optional. Or you could do it as a static landscape theater where performers are embedded in the scenic tableau. Anyway, this is a high discipline emotional containment system, so it's kind of hard to put on. But it is not a very high risk. And our final assessment will be 85%. It's good for chamber repertoire. And that's about it. The next one is Hapax. by A.E. Stallings. This is, again, poetry, but this is a recomposition of classical reference with lots of classical references. So this has translation, inflected diction, controlled metaphysical architecture, and folklore as present tense cognitive field. I won't use the word myth because everyone has their own worldview. And the governing principle is very clear. So meaning is generated through formal constraint acting on inherited narrative materials. So this can only work if medical discipline remains audible. And linguistic compression needs to be preserved. This can work because the audiences look at language constructing these folklore stories under constraint. So we have classical figures, reactivated through modern diction, emotional content filtered through formal precision, translation functioning as dramatic tension, and folklore as a simultaneous past and present action space. So you should look at the tension between the shifts in perspective, compression of narrative into lyrical event packets. And the question is how far meaning can be compressed before it becomes just a signal only. So we have authority distributed across various folkloric figures, poetic form, and speaker as the media. The constraint is that there's strict meter and rhyme structures and so forth. So time, past events are happening in present speech. It's very episodic, and we have a couple laps of historical distance here. Now, in the beginning, we have classical figures and narratives introduced as active forces. The audience goes into the folklore framework. Then we have constraint intensifying, where meter constraints emotional release. Translation creates friction, and myth and the folklore references collide or overlap. Then we have no narrative resolution. We have formal systems, which include meaning, which remains very unresolved. So lighting can be sharp, sculptural, emphasizing clarity of form and avoidance of atmospheric diffusion. You can see contrast between simplicity of staging and complexity of reference. You can use microgestures and many other things. This is more towards the audience during formal declaration moments and downward textual anchoring during dense passages. So it will not work if you really try to turn this into a spectacle. It could only work in a few ways, such as formal recital theater, 1 to 4 performances, a folklore ensemble system with multiple voices across different roles, overlapping reaction, recitation structures, and controlled polyphonic delivery. We could also use language installation theater, where people can go through the different poems with visual experience. And as far as our final assessment here, we could give it an 86 because it could work in recital theater, mythic language performance, or immersive situations, but it's not a traditional performing arts work as far as adaptation. And the last one for today is going to be Slan by A.E. van Vogt. And this is a system built around persecution as cognitive condition, enhanced intelligence as social liability, fragmented perception of reality under pressure, recursive self-awareness in hostile environments. And this is the thing, identity is not stable. It's reconstructed under external threat and internal over-processing of information. So this can work if the perception shifts are made legible on stage, not just narrative. Paranoia and clarity coexist, and the protagonist's cognition is externalized theatrically. This can work if perception accelerates beyond social comprehension, hostile environments force identity concealment, intelligence functions as both advantage and isolation in mechanism, and reality becomes unstable through interpretation overload. So this depends on shifts between clarity and misrecognition, fragmented informational revelation, and tension between internal cognition and external danger. So the question is, can heightened perception remain coherent in a world that cannot process it? So we have authority as unstable and fragmented, like institutions being hostile, opaque, and coercive, protagonist cognition, high function, and socially illegible, hidden subgroups, slant identity network. No stable authority is existing here in this story. So we have persecution state, the persecution system, and we have identity concealment requirements, constant threats, and inability to disclose, blah, 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 condition. So time is episodic and reactive, driven by pursuit, evasion, and revelation. It's non-linear, and the meaning is transmitted through shifts of information, altered states of perception, dialogue under constraint, etc. So we have the protagonist is marked as distinct, social eligibility is established, initial concealment happens, then there's pursuit networks activated, identity exposure risk becomes there, cognitive superiority becomes dangerous. We also have full stability is never achieved, identity remains structurally exposed, and we have high contrast, above surveillance, abrupt transitions, and so forth. Tension comes from concealment versus exposure. And yeah, the eye direction focuses on behavior, small gestures, facial, and other little movements. It's not about big spectacle here overall. This could involve could be chamber theater, which would be a primary mode, 3 to 8 performance, heavy use of lighting and sound to externalize cognition. It could be a multimedia installation where there's layered projections of partial information, simultaneous narrative systems, and cognitive overload. Or you could do it as a system where audience is positioned as observers. And then you have different types of environments happening. So this is a perception-driven system. And so that's very interesting. But it can be a bit hard to stage. So we're going to give this a high risk. And you really need to make sure all of your talent is safe as well. So we're only going to give this an 75%. But it is something worth reading if you want to look at a more psychological piece. And if you wanted to adapt it, of course, you have to adapt it based on where you are. Again, all of these works need to have, of course, if the author is alive, you need to talk to them or the estate, which controls the work, if that's the case. And all of these should be done with discretion, but they're very interesting, different types of works that really do give a more deeper story. Now, this does not mean that we agree with all the stories, but they're just very fascinating. So, anyway, that's where we have a lot of different elements coming into play here. And if there is one that you think that you could adapt for your theater space, of course, obviously look at all the regulations and all. This is just more of an exercise to see what could be adopted rather than what should be adopted. Anyway, that concludes our broadcast day for now. We hope you have a wonderful morning, afternoon, or evening, wherever you find yourselves.